Hey, test, test, test. Here we are. Okay. I know, first of all, welcome to the forum this Sunday morning here at All Saints Church. My name is Mike Kinman. My pronouns are he, him. It is good that we are here. Our Associate Rector, Mark Chase, was supposed to be here leading and facilitating this forum, but Chase has fallen ill. He's okay. It's not COVID. But please just send your prayers to Chase and his family. He is hopefully asleep right now, recuperating, and will back on his feet soon. But that means I get to be here, and as much as I wish Chase was feeling better, I'm thrilled to be here this morning. We know a whole bunch of you, maybe you're streaming this while you're trying to get here. It's the Rose Bowl Half Marathon this morning, and for those of you who are sitting in this room, congratulations on navigating all the closed streets and everything like that to get here this morning. For those of you who are still out there and maybe streaming this while you're driving, I hope you're just listening and not watching. And just be patient, you'll get through. And also to let you know that Pasadena Avenue on the west is now open. So if you're coming from that way, you can take Pasadena up to the 210 to Lake to Walnut, and you can get here. And we got more folks coming in right now. We're going to be starting a three-part series today, and I'm really excited about this. And we're calling it The Other America, and it's based on a speech that Dr. King gave at Stanford University in April 1967, and we're going to get into that a little more in a few minutes. But we're really talking about, for the next 3 weeks, is racially based housing disparities and wealth disparity in this country. And so much wealth disparity is based on housing restrictions that were written into law in the United States, and that we still feel the effects of, and in still cases are still written into law today that are in the process of being challenged. So this week, we're focusing on housing disparity and restrictions in the Black community in America. Next week, we're going to be focusing on the same thing in the AAPI community in America. And then the third week, we're going to talk about an organization called the Green Line Housing Foundation that is saying, okay, we're going to be a part of the solution here and learn about the work that they're doing to reverse this and have reparative work done. We are so blessed this morning to have three people here who have done extensive work on redlining and housing restrictions and housing disparities, both in the Pasadena area and all over this country. And I'm just going to let you all introduce yourselves and go down the road. And John, why don't we go ahead and start with you, your name, sort of how you come to be here with All Saints for the City, and what brought you into caring about this work.
Great, thank you. Good morning. My name is John Williams, and I am the director of the Fellowship Center for Racial Reconciliation. I've been doing that for about 6.5 years. It's part of Fellowship Church, which is based in Monrovia, but my office is actually here in Pasadena, actually at Harambe Christian Family Center is where we office, and I have been doing this work for decades. I actually started at Harambe working with Dr. John Perkins when he was here in Northwest Pasadena. So I'm just honored to be here and looking forward to this conversation.
Good morning, everybody. Glad to be here. My name is Steve Williams. I am a documentary filmmaker. I'm in the process of working on a project called A Dream Deferred that has to do with land and the shared space that we occupy in this country, and the efforts and laws that were put in place to exclude us and separate us. So that is something that this has really got me into my work. I started to interview members of my family many, many years ago, and one of the common themes that came out in those interviews that I had with my family members was terror, being chased off their land, stolen property. It just became too much of something that I had to pursue, right? And so that is something that we can talk about later. I am a member of All Saints Church, have been for 6 years. I was on the vestry, and currently working on a project called Telling the Whole Story. Thank you.
You're co-chairing the group that's working on our windows, the telling the whole story about
That's
the windows.
the stained glass windows,
stained
which
glass
has to do with iconography in the Episcopal Church. That's what
Amen. Thank you. Becky, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. I'm Becky Nicolades. I've been a member of All Saints since 1987. And I am a historian by training. I got my doctorate at Columbia, worked in academia for quite a while, and then became an independent consultant and scholar. And my main area of focus is the history of suburbia. And that story, of course, is very intertwined with this story because the suburbs were often the place where a lot of these kind of exclusionary tools were first honed and where a lot of racial lines were drawn very harshly. So that's been an ongoing part of my own work. I have a book coming out hopefully later this year or early next year called The New Suburbia with Oxford, which is a history of suburban life in LA since 1945. So I'm really excited to be here and just to be part of this conversation.
Right, go ahead.
I just wanted to acknowledge that Becky and John have been incredible resources for me in telling my story. They're amazing. Becky helps people in Hollywood and all with special projects that have to do with history. And John leads these amazing tours across the country, civil rights tours. And I met him on one of those tours, which was Pasadena, a walking history tour of Pasadena.
Yeah. And I want to say another word about Becky, because Becky, you have also worked incredibly hard on the Telling the Whole Story group about the land that the church currently occupies. And I was reading the narrative that you and Hannah and Barbara and others are putting together. And you know, when we put this out, it's going to be, I learned so much from reading that narrative, and it's going to give us so much to think about in terms of the land we occupy, the history, and how that intersects with our values. And some of that will intersect some of the conversation we're having this morning. So we're calling this The Other America because of the speech that Dr. King made. And I want to read and just frame the rest of our time this morning and really for the next 3 weeks from an excerpt of that speech. Here's what he said, and it's from a speech delivered on April 14th, 1967 at Stanford University, so in the last year of Dr. King's life. There are literally two Americas. One America is beautiful for situation, and in a sense, this America is overflowing with the milk of prosperity and the honey of opportunity. This America is the habitat of millions of people who have food and material necessities for their bodies, and culture and education for their minds, and freedom and human dignities for their spirits. In this America, millions of people experience every day the opportunity of having life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in all of their dimensions. And in this America, millions of young people grow up in the sunlight of opportunity. But tragically and unfortunately, there is another America. This other America has a daily ugliness about it that constantly transforms the ebulliency of hope into the fatigue of despair. In this America, millions of work-starved men walk the streets daily in search for jobs that do not exist. In this America, millions of people find themselves living in rat-infested, vermin-filled slums. In this America, people are poor by the millions. They find themselves perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. Just let that sink in for a second. When I hear this, one of the things that first jumps to mind for me is then Senator Obama's speech at the Democratic National Convention that really introduced him to this country, where he actually talked about there is only one America. And when I frame that against Dr. King's words here, I wonder, as rhetorically powerful as that speech was, how accurate it was, and aspirational. So I want to sort of kick this to all of you. What resonates with you about that quote, and how does it pertain to the issue of housing discrimination? Who wants to start?
Sure, I can start. One of the things that we focused on when we were doing the research for our project was asking the question of, in 1968, when the Fair Housing Act was committed, right, when it was put into place, as a result of only because of the assassination of Martin Luther King, the question that was unanswered was, what did he really want to happen with the Fair Housing Act going forward? And we would never be able to ask that question, right? So when I heard the speech that he gave at Stanford, which was in '67, almost to the year before he got assassinated, he had already turned away from sit-ins and counters to housing and equity for people. And I thought that was pretty amazing. That was impactful for me.
I think for me, just from the perspective of studying the suburbs, there was a famous quote from a 1961 U.S. Civil Rights Commission report that called the suburbs a white noose around central cities. And that imagery, I think, is just really spot on, accurate. It points to the sort of web of segregation tactics that had been used for years that created the separation and that essentially prevented Blacks, Latinos, Asians from moving into, what had been all-white neighborhoods for generations. And that report was really prescient. It was from 1961. There was another quote in that report just saying that so much of the housing market is closed off to people of color for reasons unrelated to their personal worth or their ability to pay. It really was a race-based kind of system. The other thing that it brings to mind for me, I think, is Pasadena, and the fact that Pasadena has been, throughout its history, very also caught up in this notion of separation and segregation, the idea of there being two cities within Pasadena, and all of these things play out here locally. So, yeah.
I think it's two things that stand out for me. One is I'm always inspired and intrigued by Dr. King's clarity of conviction and his clarity of thought. And he had that conviction and that clear thinking at the height of violence. Like, he was the target. And his ability to still speak the truth, to speak it in love, to tell a bigger story, just inspires me and challenges me. And what am I doing today, and how truthful am I being about the injustices that are happening in our city and during this time? And I think the other piece of it is what that speech in many, many, many school districts today would not be allowed to be shown. He goes back to 1619 in such a clever way, but it wouldn't be, that speech today cannot be shown in many, many school districts, and yet the very people who are stopping that type of speech are the first ones in line to talk about how great Dr. King was. And I use the past tense, was, because he's not a threat today for them in this moment.
Steve.
I just want to tag onto that, which was at that time, and this is just to address the risk that is involved with doing this. His approval rating was 70% negative. And that's not just the majority race, that was black, white. All the people felt that Dr. Martin Luther King was dangerous, and he was too much of a disruptor. So the fact that he would push himself through that regardless, I think, is really significant. And that's, today, we're kind of in a circle. We come back arc-wise, and I wanted to address something that Mike said in the introduction because of the way this series is going to go. The series, it's a 3-part series, but we need to really be aware that slavery, the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans and their relationships to the plantation owners and the land is where this all begins. And we cannot forget it. It is not separate issues for cultures, for minority groups. It all was related to it, but ultimately we cannot forget that this is a problem that has been existing since that time.
Well, that's such an important point. Brian Stephen talks about the link between enslavement and mass incarceration, and how as laws have changed, the same impetus and white supremacy has just morphed into different forms, and yet we don't talk as much about housing with that. And what's interesting, so 2 things about this, and I want to sort of, and we want to get to the resources that you brought. First is you've said that like this speech could not be shown in a lot of places today, and I agree with you. If Dr. King were here, or if someone else stood up and gave this exact speech today, how accurate would it be today?
That's a great question. I think it's still pretty accurate. I think the geography is shifting. It's kind of getting a little more complicated in a way. But there's still a story clearly of haves and have-nots. And it's often a very racialized kind of picture. So I think there is a lot of accuracy there. I think, John, your point about how this couldn't really even be taught in certain school districts. So one of, when people talk about how do we fix this, one of the things that this guy, Richard Rothstein, who wrote a book called Color of Law, he made a really important point, which is I think we have to have a shared understanding of this history. And that is so complicated in this polarized politics in this time that we are in, exactly what you're talking about. So all the arguments around critical race theory and this type of thing, some of that resistance goes right to the heart of this history in a way. And how do we kind of come to a kind of shared understanding of the past, in a sense, and how these structures and the structures of housing discrimination, segregation, how all of that was put into place. As a historian, I feel like it's all pretty clear cut. We have a lot of evidence kind of documenting this, and we'll share some of that this morning. This map behind us over here is one piece of that. But it's a challenge. It really is a challenge, I think. But I think it resonates a little too well still.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Becky, that you make. And I want to just make a comment on the fact that a large majority of people think that the issue exists in the southern part of our United States. And that is not the case. Martin Luther King in this speech talks about the challenge of being in Chicago in a neighborhood he should never have been in there when he went to live there for a year, and the vehement and the vitriol hatred that he existed. There's a phrase that says the most segregated cities in America are in the north, right? And we can't forget that. When I was on my trip back east and doing most of my research, because, hey, that's Virginia, that's Richmond, that's where the colonies were, that's where things got started. But the aha moment was when I came back to California and Pasadena and realized how reflective that was. And it's California. We think we're in a special place, right? But that's to be told.
and like think about where you grew up in Northern California, in Oakland and San Francisco. Rothstein's book, which is phenomenal, I'm listening to the audiobook now, he doesn't start off talking about Birmingham. He starts off talking about the San Francisco Bay Area, which is one of the most liberal metropolitan areas in the country. And so this is everywhere. So I want to get to sort of some of the specifics here and talk about redlining. Now, redlining is a term that I think in the last 5 to 10 years, people have become more familiar with, but I think it can also be one of those terms that people have heard but don't quite know what it means. And so I'd be interested in saying, well, what exactly does it mean? And also, Steve, you drew that line. You said it all begins with enslavement. I'd love it if you all could even talk a little about sort of how did redlining itself even evolve, and then sort of, what does it look like? And I know we've got some maps here.
I see John looking at me. What I would love to do is just kind of walk us through how we get to that. So it was a process, and I will say that, you still hear this even talked about in this way that, those patterns were just natural, that certain groups gravitated to certain neighborhoods. That's what the courts called de facto segregation, where it just happened to be like that in a natural way, and that that's how our kind of social geography evolved. But it's really, really not the case. It really came about as a result of deliberate practices and policies that were put into place over decades throughout much of the 20th century. And the way it evolves, it starts at the local level, and then it works its way all the way up to the federal government. And that's that map there. So what I'm hoping you guys can indulge me a little is I want to just walk you guys through like some of those tools of segregation that were used starting at the local and then ending up at the federal, so we can kind of see how that process unfolded. Steve, could you? Yeah. And let's see, I will say, so, okay, so here we go. Maybe, let's go, here, let me just, I can do it, I can advance. Okay, so it starts at the local, and one of the first groups that was really instrumental in all of this were developers. They were the ones who first began initiating these efforts kind of as a way to sell property, because they had the idea that if we can promise certain things to home buyers, that things won't change, that they'll be protected in a certain way, then that'll protect their property values into the future. It becomes a kind of selling point. And so that has to do with lots of aspects of how people could use their land, and that eventually would include sort of the racial angle on that. So they begin kind of using restrictions as a kind of selling point for property. You can see in this ad for Flint Ridge, right near us here, it mentions it's a little hard to read on the right-hand side, protective restrictions on all lots. That was code for racial restrictions at that time, very common. And this goes all the way through the 1950s and 60s, even, which was the peak period of suburban expansion in the United States. That was an era of explosive home building in suburban developments. And what happens then, so that was a period, you just have to really keep that in your head, that the 50s and 60s was a period of maximum affordability, because it was very affordable to get an FHA loan and be able to buy a house, and maximum production of this housing. And at that peak time, a lot of developers simply refused to sell homes to blacks. One of the most famous developers from that time were the Levitts, who built Levittown back in New York, and there was a famous quote from William Levitt, who said we can solve a housing problem or we can try to solve a racial problem, but we cannot combine the two. So they operated from that space of believing that if they sold homes to blacks, that their white buyers would not like that. And so they just simply would outright refuse to sell to them. And what that does is it closed off a huge segment of the housing market to blacks as well as Latinos and Asians, at a time when housing was super affordable and cheap, and you could get it with very low down payments and very favorable terms. So that was huge. A second tool, and I'm sure many of you have heard of this one, were race restrictive covenants. So what was this? These were basically legal provisions that would be written into your property deed. And so that, when you bought the house, there would be a clause in the deed saying, I will not sell this home to a non-Caucasian. And so it was a legally binding agreement that basically obligated the buyer of property to not sell it to anybody who basically wasn't white. And usually these deeds were intended to run with the land. So even as property might, if it might have been sold or property changed hands, the deeds would continue. They tended to last for 30 years or in that vicinity. And then sometimes they would expire. Sometimes they were in perpetuity. In 1948, the Supreme Court declares them unconstitutional. Oh, I'm sorry. So this is an example of one of these deeds. And I think John, you said you might have had an example too. But it's a lot of the legal language around not selling to a person who is not of the white or Caucasian race. So the Shelley versus Kramer decision in 1948, that was a Supreme Court case that ruled these provisions unconstitutional or unenforceable, although there were people still found ways to get around them, and that's kind of the next thing. So one of the other ways, though, and entities that were really important, especially in this early story, were neighborhood protective associations. So in 1910 through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, basically the idea being that the race restrictive covenants wouldn't really work unless all property owners in a neighborhood had them. And so neighbors would form these protective associations. They were sometimes called improvement associations or even homeowner associations. They would get together and basically put group pressure on people in a neighborhood to make sure that their covenants were up to date and that everybody was kind of having them and that they were, abiding by all of that. In LA, as I just found out fairly recently, by the late 1930s, a bunch of race restrictive covenants started to expire. And so what happens is there are these campaigns that were launched by these sort of groups, but also by the chambers of commerce in Pasadena in 1939, and then in towns like La Cañada, Glendale, South Pasadena, all of the surrounding communities, they all push these covenant writing and renewal campaigns. I found this article from La Cañada where Frank Lanterman, who was the president of the Chamber of Commerce there, was behind a big push to make sure that everybody was going to renew their covenants, down to the thing where they were going door to door and charging people $4 to take care of the paper, all the legal paperwork, to make sure that the deeds were up to date. And the same kind of thing was done in Pasadena in 1939.
Becky, can I jump in just for a moment?
Absolutely.
Can you go back to the prior slide? Because I want to point something out. So you have these four mechanisms. that are in place to create segregation and separation. All three, and the fourth one that she had, the bullet point, all of those applied here in Pasadena. There was a Pasadena Neighborhood Improvement Association. There were racially restrictive covenants. There was redlining. And so when Becky said earlier that you had these things locally that were pushing up to the federal level, it was not only that, it was going up and down. And so when you get to the slide where you have a newspaper article and these folks brazenly saying, this is what we need to do, it was a matter of course. It was a matter of custom and culture, and it was a matter of law. And we have to really understand that's what we were fighting against, and that's what we're still fighting against. And so I'm sorry I wanted to interrupt, but I really want to keep centering it and localizing it to our town.
And just to that point, in Pasadena, when they launched their covenant renewal campaign in 1939, that was also done by members of the Chamber of Commerce. There was a Pasadena City Councilman that was part of that
A.I.
effort.
Stewart is his name.
Yeah, thank you. You are on top of that history. And then another thing that was part of this whole system were professional real estate practices. So realtors played a huge role in this too. So there were a couple things worth mentioning quickly. One is they tended to do what was called steering, where they would basically steer people of color away from white neighborhoods so that they just wouldn't show them property in white communities. And this was actually part of their professional code. So in 1924, the National Association of Real Estate Boards established a code of ethics that basically prohibited realtors from introducing people of a different race into a particular community. And if they violated it, they could lose their license. So there were professional penalties to be paid if you violated those kind of regulations. And it was very widespread well through the 1950s.
Can I tack something onto that?
Totally.
Claire and I moved to Pasadena in 1984. And we bought our first house in Altadena. And we had an African-American realtor, right? Skip ahead 3 years later, we wanted to buy another home. And we were looking east of Lake Avenue. And we went to our realtor, and he says, I, in all my career, have not been able to sell a house east of Lake. They don't allow me to do that as a realtor. We listed our home. We bought the home from him over by the Altadena golf course. That was the first home in 1991. No, 1991 was before that, but it was the first house that he had sold east of Lake Avenue.
Well, and I want to sort of flip the script on that from a white perspective, which is when we were looking to buy a house in St. Louis, we wanted to buy in the city, and we had realtors actively discouraging us. In fact, what they said is they had a word for it. They called it pioneering for a white family to buy. And it's like we wanted to buy into this, and we were actively discouraged from buying into black neighborhoods.
Yeah, so it's still happening. I think I've read recently that the realtors are trying to, correct for some of this, have some reconciliation in California. So those are good steps. Another thing was zoning, which I'll just, Steve knows a lot about this one, but I'll just say that the use of R1 zoning, which is basically to, you designate that a neighborhood can only have single-family homes, that has also been a way of excluding, apartments and multifamily, affordable housing. And that, I think, also has been definitely seen as a way of reinforcing segregation. In really high-end communities, it's called exclusionary zoning or snob zoning, where properties have to hit a certain minimum value So that has been at work too, and I think that's been a really powerful piece of this. And then another thing, of course, that was used was, unfortunately, violence and intimidation. This was a common part of our history in cities and suburban areas across the United States. This was not a Southern thing. As you guys mentioned earlier, this was happening all over the place. So there were numerous examples of white residents using physical intimidation to keep people of color out of their neighborhoods. There were local examples here in Pasadena. In the early 1900s, there were 3 Black-owned homes that were burned to the ground. In 1947, the LA Urban League identified 26 techniques that white homeowners used to keep Black home seekers out of their neighborhoods, including bombings, death threats, vandalism, cross burnings, paying off neighbors to not sell to Blacks, and on and on. And these attacks peaked in the 1950s and 60s, really the heyday of the suburban era in the United States. And then, so this now finally brings us to the federal story. So all of these tactics were really strong at the local level. Now it all starts to percolate up to the federal level in the 1930s. And that's when the federal government first enters the picture of this. And I think it's safe to say that the federal government reinforced a lot of these policies that were already in place, that they didn't necessarily instigate them at this early phase, but they were definitely playing a key role in reinforcing a lot of these practices once they got into the act. And this was the first time that the federal government gets involved in the private housing market, is in the 1930s. So there were 2 agencies that were key here that you see on the slide here. These were New Deal agencies that were formed during the Depression, that were meant to kind of jumpstart the housing industry and help people who were like on the verge of having their homes foreclosed on. So the first agency, the HOLC, was that basically gave direct loans to people, or low interest loans, or it helped refinance mortgages. The FHA, which you'll recognize because it's still around, basically, that agency was way more important and it lasted longer. And instead of loaning money directly, it insured mortgages that were given by private banks. So that was a key piece of this. And this also, just to keep in mind, was the very first time that the long-term low-interest mortgage became a thing, was through these programs. Before, it was much more expensive and harder to be able to buy a home.
We got about 7 minutes left and
Okay.
I want to make sure we get to
sorry.
John and your stuff, so if we can,
Okay.
thanks.
So just really quick, the HOLC comes up with a plan to rate neighborhoods as security risks for these loans. They basically sent people out into every neighborhood in the urban U.S., including here. That's the map. And they looked at a neighborhood. These were often realtors doing these appraisals. And they would say, is this a neighborhood a good risk for a loan? And they came up with a rating system. And this was the rating system. So the places that got the highest rating tended to be white, suburban, no industry, just very clean cut, like fairly well-off neighborhoods, and then it went down from there. The red neighborhoods were places that basically had the opposite traits. So they tended to be diverse, where people of color might live, industry might be nearby, there might be various types of housing in these areas. And so the D, if a person of color or if they lived in those neighborhoods, and I looked at all these records for LA, if blacks lived in a particular neighborhood, it automatically got a red rating. It didn't matter if they were middle class or well-to-do, it was automatically given that red rating. That is the origin of the term redlining. And what happens is the FHA picks up on that appraisal system and uses it as a basis for how they would give out loans. And just really quick, I'm sorry I'm taking so much of the time here. So this is the same map that John had brought in. So this is the Pasadena area. And I did pass out some examples of the worksheets that were used. And there's actually examples of the worksheets on the table over there. And yeah, so you can kind of look at the language that was used. This is Los Angeles in general. And then I was part of a research group that wrote a study for the city of LA on the roots of housing discrimination. We think about like the repercussions of these policies. Those maps left a big footprint. And you can see it on a map like this, which is the HOLC map of all of LA. And then you look at like, where was historic public housing located, that's the black dots on there, as well as where were freeways located. They were often run through the red rated neighborhoods. So I will stop because I feel like I'm sorry about that. But anyway, that is kind of the story of those roots.
And I think there's a deeper analysis that goes into this. And there's a question that we must ask ourselves is, how is this able to occur? How did this happen? Why did this happen? And really it goes to story. We all, especially over the last 15, 20 years, there's been this deluge of people talking about the power of story, the power of story, the power of narrative. Well, there's a narrative that's associated with all of these mechanisms to create segregation that was, we have to dehumanize, we have to use language in a way that dehumanizes people. And one of the things that Becky and I, we were talking the other day on the phone, and we're just commenting on, when you go through these area descriptions, the language that's used in the red areas so dehumanizes Black and brown folks that allows for people who might be in the middle, who don't have any malintent, who aren't malicious or evil, but they adopt and they accept that language. And so there's language like Black people have infiltrated a particular neighborhood. And so when you think of the term infiltration, I know growing up where I grew up, I think of rodents, I think of insects. I think of the necessity to get rid of rodents and insects in my house because they've infiltrated my house. That same kind of logic happens when we talk about people. And so it's really critical that we understand that how were we able to allow a redlining map, racially restrictive covenants, and all of the things that Becky went through, and for people, for good people to allow that to happen. And it happens because of narrative. And Dr. King, to kind of bring it back to the other America, in the speech he talks about where people are saying, non-Black people are saying, well, you should be able to make it. We've had immigrants come to this country. I'm a poor white person, and I was able to pull myself up by the bootstraps. All of that language, and you're able to take just those words, stitch them together, and completely ignore the analysis of why those Black and brown folks are in the circumstances that they're in. And so we have to be really careful and cautious and give a clear, or rather a deep interrogation of words, of language. I became an attorney because of words. I love words. My grandfather taught me to love words. Words have power, words have meanings. Words can move people to commit atrocities, and words can move people to do brilliant acts of love and just good humanity. And so I'll pause and I'll toss it to Steve. I don't know if you have any other thing. I know we're getting ready to wind down.
Go ahead.
Yes, I want to basically say that because these are hard. I don't think any of us up here would say we have a solution. That's not the issue. The issue is the solution at first is education and awareness. I think that is really the biggest thing, and I think it's our biggest battle that we're going to fight right now, is that we understand that ultimately when Becky talks about the taxes that were used to separate black and brown people in minorities from particular areas, it was usually terrorist activities. 1919 through 1930 was the beginning of terrorism in black communities. The 1921 was called Red Summer for a reason. And where that really was trying to destroy Tulsa, Oklahoma, right? Rosewood, Florida. Those places where blacks had really started to put a foothold in the ground were taking away. There was a resentment from that. Well, that exists today. If we look at what was January 6th, there's a root in that if you really look at it, what was in January 6th. And what is the destruction of voting rights accessibility? The ability to overturn some of these things when we talk about solutions started in 1964 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. There was no representation before that time, right? And I think that's really where we need to go forward.
Yeah. And we're going to be talking next week we've talked here about how this affects the black and brown community, and next week we're going to talk about the AAPI community, and you're going to see a lot of the same things, and they take different forms. Before we thank folks and people here in the room, we can stick around a little longer and continue this conversation. We've got to say goodbye to the folks online. I want to close out with another quote from Dr. King. One of the things that has kept this going today is fear, and it is fear that is based on loss of wealth, and that is that whole sort of the phrase "there goes the neighborhood" has roots, and it is part of the capitalist system that we live in that stokes this fear. And Steve, you talked about, Dr. King was one of the most hated people in America when he was when he was assassinated, and this is the weekend that we try to pretend that Dr. King didn't say a lot of the things that he said, particularly the last couple years of his life. And in the last year of his life, he gave another speech, and it was called The Three Evils of Society. And here's a quote from that. He said, "We have deluded ourselves into believing the myth that capitalism grew and prospered out of the Protestant ethic of hard work and sacrifice. The fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both black and white, both here and abroad." And so this is a big part of the engine that continues to drive all of this, is that profits and wealth mean more than people, to the point that as we have it, we will throw other people under the bus for fear of losing what we have and losing our privilege and advantages. And this series wraps up with hope, because there is really good work that is being done, and it's part of what we're trying to be about here. So we need to let Keith go and get ready for the service. Everyone, please, can we say thank you so much to Becky and Steve and John. If you're here in the room, you can continue the conversation. Those of you who are online, we'll see you in church. Thanks.
Yes, yeah, look at the map. Come up and John, I'll talk you through the map. And I want to give a shout out to Brian.